A musical starring Lady Gaga wearing clown makeup? Obviously, I was going to have to share my thoughts.
Tell us, what's changed, Arthur?
Hi, I'm LadyJenevia, and on my channel, I like to talk about entertainment media. If you are new to my channel, the way that I do my opening weekend film reviews is I begin with a spoiler-free section, and then I follow that up with a spoiler section, so all of you are free to proceed as far as you prefer. The sections are timestamped. Joker, Folie à Deux is a sequel to the 2019 film Joker. The sequel takes place 2 years after the events of that first film and brings back Joaquin Phoenix as Arthur Fleck/Joker, Zazie Beetz as Sophie Dumont, Arthur's neighbor whom he had imagined being in a relationship with, Lee Gill as Arthur's former co-worker Gary, and Sharon Washington as Arthur's former social worker. The sequel also has the same director and composer as the first film, which is understandable, particularly for the latter since she won an Oscar for her work. Throughout all the controversy and discourse the first film sparked, the two things more or less everyone agreed on was that the lead actor and score deserved to collect accolades all throughout the award show season. I myself rated the first film favorably, but when the rumblings about a sequel began to gain momentum, I was displeased. I thought a sequel would be completely unnecessary, that the first story didn't lend itself to continuing into a sequel, and then the headlines exploded with one thing: Joker 2 is greenlit and it will be a musical co-starring Lady Gaga as Harley Quinn. And my immediate response was, I will be there opening weekend. What can I say? I reserve the right to change my mind about anything and anyone at any time for any reason. Let me first begin with where I landed for my Letterboxd rating. I ended up landing on 4 stars. If you have at least a few strong elements that I have positive feedback for, I usually land on 4 stars for a new release within the calendar year. If you're new to my channel, I grade new releases on a curve so that they make sense in my mind in relation to each other as I rank them on a private list in preparation for the top 10 video that I and every other film channel publishes at the end of the year. Surprising absolutely no one, Joaquin Phoenix and Lady Gaga's performances were excellent. I never expected anything less than that. I suppose if I had to nitpick something about their relationship, it's that, well, I suppose I thought we would get to see more of them interacting with one another than we got, but ultimately, the story is still first and foremost a continuation of Arthur Fleck's journey from the first film, and that's not a talking point I can immediately elaborate on without going into spoilers, so I will pause that for the time being. I find that the idea of Lady Gaga playing Harley Quinn opposite Joaquin Phoenix's Joker was simply too exciting for me to not have absurdly high expectations. If I could have been a bit more neutral when entering a first watch, I probably would not be nitpicking the amount of screen time they have interacting with each other, because what we see and what we don't see is more than good enough to serve the larger story being told in this film, as well as continuing what was introduced in the 2019 film. If anything, the biggest nitpick I had with this sequel was the fact that it was announced as a musical, and I don't think that's an accurate description. Music is used as a narrative tool and a means of further communicating what's going on internally for the main characters of Joker and Harley Quinn, but it's not a movie musical with the big lavish musical numbers that one would expect to get when you say musical starring Lady Gaga as Harley Quinn. And I would take that point a step further insofar as these Joker films are period pieces. Gotham may be a fictional place, but they very much modeled their version of it after classic old school Martin Scorsese New York City. There are no mobile phones or computers. The cars are all vintage by the standards of the audience watching the films at the cinema. And this sequel is referencing classic musically oriented works of art. You're referencing Fred Astaire, a man who shot to stardom in movie musicals almost a century ago. The very first Fred and Ginger films, well, most of the Fred and Ginger films actually, they were in black and white because that was what the standard was for the film industry at that point in time. But anyway, you are not going to play naive with the audience and act as if we're being peculiar for presuming that you were going to deliver a certain caliber of musical number when casting Lady Gaga. Not only is she a well-regarded icon of pop music, dance choreography had a very strong role in many of those iconic music videos of hers. We are not wrong to be disappointed when you don't deliver more of those big, lavish musical numbers reminiscent of the Technicolor era of MGM movie musicals. Every viewer is going to bring certain biases into their viewing experience. My bias is that I love a big Technicolor MGM musical number. Going for a more natural delivery, having Lady Gaga try to sing less well in certain scenes because her character isn't a trained singer the way that Lady Gaga is in real life, I don't love that. I don't. We're going to have to agree to disagree on some of these creative choices. I think there was absolutely room to still tell the story that you wanted to tell, address the topics and themes that run through the narrative, and still deliver the grandiose musical numbers that I and other movie musical viewers would have wanted to see. You were also not doing yourself any favors when certain key images or imagery that were present in the film's promotional trailers, posters, or pictures that were making their rounds online because you were filming publicly outside are showing things that did not appear in the actual film. Why is there an entire musical sequence of Joker and Harley on the steps doing a high kick? And clearly it was fierce because you put that all over the promotion. It was on the posters being passed out at my cinema, and it wasn't in the film. I didn't even take a poster because you're not going to bamboozle me with a musical number that you didn't actually put into your film. Now I know I've been very critical of this particular talking point, so you might be wondering how I managed to land on 4 stars. Well, in addition to Joaquin and Lady Gaga delivering excellent performances, visually, I just can't fault the film. The costumes, makeup, production design, cinematography, and of course the score. It was all very well put together, and that was resonating especially well for my first watch because my first watch was in IMAX. There was a period of time where I felt like the film was beginning to drag. It was somewhere about midway through the runtime, or perhaps 2/3 through. However, this is yet another example of why I remain adamant that the theatrical experience is superior. If a streaming release starts to lose the viewer, there is every chance that that viewer is going to just click out. But when I am seated in the cinema, I am going to stay put and see the story through to the end. And once I actually had the full picture of everything, and I was able to reflect back on it as a complete work of art afterwards, I mostly really liked the execution of the storytelling. Even the issues I had with the way the film underused the musical concept, I could at least better understand what they were going for with how and why the musical parts of the film were done in the ways that they were. When watching the first film, it was very clear to me that the story was painting a clear correlation between the lack of resources and social welfare for people in need, and how those things exacerbated Arthur's trauma and mental illnesses, and everything escalated into this very public violent outburst. Now, of course, correlation does not equate to causality, but nonetheless, correlation is still something to keep in mind. Midway through the sequel, I couldn't tell where they were going with the story, and it felt like things were just going on and on. I won't give specifics just yet, but Arthur is on trial for what he did in the first film, and I don't consider it a spoiler to share that point because it's in the trailer and the photos that were making their rounds on social media of the actors filming outside a courthouse. There was a point where the trial felt like it was going on, and I didn't understand what the story was trying to say about Arthur, what sort of outcome I was supposed to want for him. But once we reached the end of the film, I did feel like things crystallized more. It also felt unexpectedly timely, unfortunately, with sort of broader topics the story aligns with that exist in real life. There isn't a way for me to comfortably explain that without spoilers, so for now I would simply say that overall it's a good film, and this feels like a complete duology. I don't foresee this playing out in a way that goes on and on. There will presumably be plenty of other DC films, but this specific universe doesn't feel like one that's going to expand into a giant series with dozens of films attached to it.
That's what we should be talking about.
But now let's talk about some of the spoilers. The relationship between Harley and Joker felt fresh and also well aligned with the story of this film and the broader topics that are addressed in this universe. With this trial, we see that there's an awareness of this broader cultural propensity of some people engaging in hero worship of violent men and the media spectacle that happens with televised trials. Where this version of Harley and Joker's relationship ties into that is that we eventually learn that Harley voluntarily checked herself into the treatment facility specifically to meet Arthur. So she's that word what is it called? Hybristophilia. It's the condition where you're attracted to violent criminals. When the two of them were initially meeting one another and starting to build their connection, I was a bit confused when she got out and then we were having these long stretches where they weren't interacting as much. You would think that if you have a new version of Joker and Harley, and especially with two actors as intensely committed to their craft as Joaquin Phoenix and Lady Gaga, that you would want to make the most of that casting choice by having them do a lot more scenes together. But it wasn't until the trial was well underway and there was all of this attention being placed on the framing of the camera showing the trial as being televised. You even see Arthur looking into the camera that's filming him within that universe. And also a lot of focus being placed on the people who are obsessed with Joker and celebrate him for his violent crimes. That was when it began to make more sense that Joker and Harley Quinn don't interact as much. This story is not interested in celebrating Joker's violence and breaking him out just so that he and Harley can go on some bombastic rampage. When I circle back to the criticisms I had about the film under-delivering on what I wanted to see from a musical starring Lady Gaga as Harley Quinn, I can see what they were trying to convey with the different types of songs and the way that they were presented in the film. The biggest musical number with the most lavish production design was the one where Arthur was feeling the most, I suppose you could use words like manic and euphoric. He's gone off his meds at this point. He's spiraling deeper into the fantasy and delusion of what it means to be this Joker character, being idolized by Harley Quinn and all of these fans. So the worse Arthur is doing in regards to his mental health, the more delusional he is, the more he's buying into something that isn't real. When the delusion is less severe, the setting doesn't change as much. There isn't a whole makeup and costume change with a new set, a stage, lights, a full-on dance number that's basically a ballroom dance number. Would I have rated this film higher if you had delivered a full roster of big musical numbers? Yeah, probably, because I love to see that. Do I still acknowledge that there is a cohesive vision, well executed, that makes narrative sense for the story and the characters you've presented? Also, yes. Even the fact that Harley breaks up with Arthur once he breaks the fantasy, that sent a very clear message of what the story was about and what sort of relationship they actually had. Now, I still don't understand why you opted to cut whatever musical number was happening on those stairs, but I'm going to assume that movie musicals are not your area because no one who understands that genre would cut something like that out. Even if the story didn't change and they still had their breakup on those stairs, you could have still had the musical number that was filmed there. Harley, and I know that she's called Lee in the film, but I'm calling her Harley because, well, let's be real here, that's the more pop culturally recognizable name for that character, and it will make a lot more sense to anyone watching the spoiler section without having seen the film first. So, Harley, she mentions those stairs to Arthur. It's when they're still in their romantic fantasy and she is wooing him. She talks about those stairs as a place she would walk on. So whether it's an extension of the story she's telling him or perhaps a fantasy he has about being out of prison and being with her back on those steps, there is room to let us see a musical number that obviously a bunch of planning went into since these two were doing high kicks together in full hair and makeup. Now, I am going to continue to hold that grudge. It's not going anywhere. Release that number after the theatrical run because I know that the girls want to see it. And I don't mean the girls as a gender thing, it's a vibe thing. If dude is gender neutral slang for some English speakers, I will continue to say the girls as gender neutral slang too. Another thing that I was somewhat surprised to see was that this film could very easily be interpreted as being anti-prison system. I'm not going to go so far as to say that the people making this are prison abolitionists, but merely that the story exists in such a way that an abolitionist reading is readily accessible. The prison system is very clearly presented as not being helpful. Arthur Fleck is a mentally ill individual who grew up in a vicious cycle of poverty and abuse, and even when he's able to encounter a person in these larger structural systems that are supposed to help people and are doing their best to do so, it's simply never enough because of how fundamentally broken these systems are. Social services get their funding cut. CPS failed to permanently remove him from the household where he was being harmed as a child. His lawyer is presented in this sequel as someone that is genuinely trying to help him, but But when you have all of these other influences coming into play and the system is fundamentally broken, this lawyer's best efforts and intentions are not enough to beat everything else working against him. At the beginning of the film, he's got a routine, he's taking his medication, and as far as we can tell, he's doing better. But the system that he lives under does not fundamentally exist to help people. And I really found that the story of this sequel resonated with me more because of real-world events that happen to be occurring at the same time as this film's release. So let me reiterate that I do not believe that the events weighing most heavily on my mind when I saw the film were sources of inspiration for the film as it was being made. They would have already finished making the film before these things happened, but there have been natural disasters washing away entire small towns in the South, and these horrifying pictures and videos coming out of things like police guarding stores to prevent people from getting to supplies that they need to survive. And then we've got poisonous gas spreading across Atlanta because of a lab fire, and the systems of power are not doing anything to help people in need who are going to face real, severe health consequences. All of these things are the same struggle in my eyes, the needs of a few being prioritized over the needs of many, the most vulnerable people being left to fend for themselves. And going back to the weather, natural disasters issue, I've seen some people asking the question about the people who are incarcerated in those areas affected. Were they evacuated or were they just left locked up in their cells? Sometimes when I review films, depending on the type of audience that film attracts, sometimes I will receive comments from people who do not like when I connect works of fiction to real-world issues or real-world ongoings. But what is happening to so many people is too severe for me to just put out of my mind. I cannot watch a film in which police violently attack prisoners just because they feel like it and not think about the onslaught of imagery of police blocking people who have experienced one of the worst disasters in their lives from getting to basic supplies that they need to stay alive. And as for this film's ending, I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that it was very easy for me to interpret the narrative as being anti-death penalty. Arthur Fleck is found guilty of his crimes and he's sentenced to death. And what becomes abundantly clear when you watch the film through to the end is that the death penalty does not solve anything. Executing Arthur Fleck for his many crimes will not help society as a whole. The systemic issues that helped to create Arthur Fleck did not just create him, they created others like him. Arthur Fleck dies at the end of the film, but not because he was sentenced to death. He gets shanked in prison by another mentally ill criminal who had previously hero-worshipped Arthur, and then decided that Arthur wasn't good enough to reach that standard that he had built up in his mind. So again, you are tying things back to this idea of unhealthy hero worship, whether it's one that you are bestowing on violent criminals or just celebrities in general, if you think about what happened to someone like John Lennon. But in this situation, of course, you can look at the way they played this out as a means of sticking to the DC side of things and insinuate that this man who took out Arthur Fleck is now the new Joker. He's telling a joke, he's doing violent crime, and while Arthur is dying, you see this man out of focus behind Arthur using the knife to carve a smile on his own face, a la Heath Ledger's Joker design. But I think this ending ties back perfectly into the larger topics the film's story is addressing. We don't know the backstory of this new Joker, but if you were to follow the threads of what these two films have presented, as well as the fact that this man is locked up in the same place as Arthur Fleck, it's a reasonable assumption that he's there for similar reasons to Arthur Fleck, and similar circumstances have helped to create that man. And this is a better ending than doing something like leaving Arthur alive behind bars, but now on death row, or even doing a time jump to his execution. This ending directly shows that the death of Arthur Fleck changes nothing. I enjoy seeing a film like this that touches on these issues, particularly in a way that I would not normally expect to see among the increasing onslaught of corporate superhero IP movies. Movies that feel extremely vapid in their so-called ideological messaging. But I do also want to clarify that I don't think this Joker film is particularly radical in what it discusses. It feels more like Minority Report, where it's a film that doesn't present a solution to the corruption and inequality of the world of the story and the ways that that fictional world may bear resemblance to the world of the audience. It merely holds up a mirror to that systemic inequality, or perhaps shines a light on it. If you are boiling it down to the most simple terms, it's a film saying, things are really bad for us, huh? Like, yeah, thanks. I already knew that. But nonetheless, I ended up rating it favorably overall when I average all of my various points of feedback together. I feel like both of these Joker films have been considerably more controversial to the broader film audience, where people have these really strong opinions of loving or hating the first or second one, and it makes me feel very boring in comparison when I go, well, yeah, I liked it, but I don't care enough to argue with anyone if they have an opinion that's the exact opposite of mine.
Sing hallelujah, come on, get happy. Get ready for the judgment day.